The bracket is set. Selection Sunday is in the rearview mirror, and that is giving way to a Boren Blitz on a Monday on the Podcast Daily. That is Zach Boren. I am Austin Ward. In Ohio State, Zach, they've got the hardest path of anyone in college football. They're still playing. They have a shot at the national title, but I don't think Sunday was exactly what Ohio State was hoping for, nor do I think it is what they should have seen.
No, it's by far the hardest path in all of college football. I mean, you look at the 8-9 game, and there needs to be so many corrections to the college football playoff, and I think that's going to happen. But with this year right now, there's no change in it. And by all means, do I agree with the seeding? No, that's not how I would have ranked them whatsoever. But it's the hand that Ohio State was dealt. It obviously goes back to their performance against Michigan, and that's why they're in this position. So at this point, you see your opponents, you see the bracket. You can only put your head down and start moving forward.
Yeah, I agree, and I will preface this by saying that it is an imperfect system. It is a very flawed system. We already knew that going in, and it's a difficult task that the College Football Playoff Selection Committee has, but I don't think it's an impossible one. And it's crazy to me how they continue to make so many mistakes that are apparent. Like, they could have worked around here, where having Penn State specifically over Ohio State makes no sense. And I know what you're saying, like, the clearest path forward for Ohio State would have been beating Michigan, but that didn't happen. And Penn State also didn't beat Ohio State in Happy Valley. So one of those things I think should be more significant than the other, but that's my opinion.
I could not agree with you more. I think they should have put Penn State behind Ohio State for sure. I mean, of those teams that were hosting home playoff games, right, that weren't getting the automatic buys, there were two of them who played each other, right? Like, Texas didn't play Notre Dame, Texas didn't play anyone, Notre Dame didn't play any of the three. Ohio State and Penn State have the same record, and they played one another. Why they put Penn State ahead of Ohio State? And I understand they played 13 games and Ohio State played 12. Get it. But at the same time, when you have the same number of losses and you've played one another, you have to look at that and seed accordingly. And that did not happen. So I think there should be a bunch of questions that are asked on why Penn State was seated at the 6 and Ohio State's at the 8. I also think there's a lot of questions when you look at Texas's resume and why they're at 5. Personally, I would have put Notre Dame at 5. Because if you look at Texas and what they've done, yes, they beat Michigan at Michigan. I get it. But outside of that, you look at their other wins. Their best win on the year is Texas A&M, who's 8-4, right? And so when you start putting that in perspective, what kind of resume is that when you start matching them up with the other teams in the playoff that are hosting home playoff games?
Yeah, that was the thing that I think irritated me the most on Sunday. Zach, was like, not just that Penn State was seated ahead of Ohio State, but that they were 2 seed lines clear, like that there was a team in between. How Penn State stayed ahead of Notre Dame, I don't understand. But like, it's I'll never fully understand it. Every single year, Selection Sunday brings stuff that makes no sense. But when you look at this and we say the hardest path forward, Zach, like, we're talking about an SEC opponent, which we all really like the opportunity to see for SEC sure. Teams going north, and it is certainly well within reason for Ohio State to beat Tennessee. They're favored by more than a touchdown in that game, and then it's a Rose Bowl against Oregon. So, that's a meaty jump into the playoff in this 12-team era, and not going to be easy. And then potentially, if Texas can get through a relatively clear path, that would be the semifinal opponent. You're not going to get much more daunting than that. And it's crazy when you look at what some of the other opportunities are in front of, Clemson being in the field. There's nothing you can do about that. But Arizona State, Boise State getting buys. It's wild how this worked out so negatively for Ohio State based off of, yes, a loss that they could have changed and a one they could have controlled. But the path forward now is incredibly difficult.
Specifically, if you look at the bracket, you look at Penn State and Texas, they by far have the easiest path out of anyone to get to the Final Four. And that's even over Oregon and Georgia, who are the number 1 and number 2 seed, because more than likely Oregon obviously is going to be playing 8 or 9 with Ohio State and Tennessee, 2 massive brands in college football, 2 teams that the programs are rich with talent, can beat anyone on any day. And then you look at Georgia, who's more than likely going to get Notre Dame who's a very, very good team, right?
Yeah.
And so if you look at Arizona State and Boise, who have buys, and more than likely you've got Texas and Penn State going up against them, like there is a huge drop off in talent when you talk about Arizona State and Boise compared to Texas and Penn State. And so there's a huge fall there. We could get into everything. I think the two biggest things that people need to look at with this playoff moving forward is obviously the automatic buys for conference championships. I think conference champions deserve to be in the playoff, but I think you should seed accordingly. For example, Clemson, Boise, Arizona State should have been seeded where they were, which I think in this year's playoff would have been 12, 11, and not the 9 seed, right? Something like that, or 12, 10 in the 9 seed, whatever it might be. The other thing that I think they have to look at, and no one has brought this up, is you have to reseed after the first round, right? The number 1 seed should face the lowest seed in chronological order, 2, 3, and 4, right? Like that's the way it should be. It's the only most fair way, because then you are rewarding the number 1 seed to playing the lowest seed that's left after the first round. And if you always look at this, the 8-9 matchup are always going to be big time programs, right? Because normally in the playoff, with the way it is, they're going to be very good teams. And so if you continue to move forward with that, the 1 seed is constantly going to be playing the winner of the 8-9, when there's a very good chance that there's some upsets that happen. And again, you look at Texas and Penn State, and them facing a Boise and an Arizona State in the second round. Like, there are so many different moving parts with this that they need to iron out before next year. But by far, I mean, Oregon and Georgia have a tough road, being the number 1 and number 2 seeds. Obviously, Ohio State and Tennessee have a super hard road with having to go through themselves, then Oregon, and then very much it's going to be Texas in the Final Four, which is going to be a tough opponent. And then you're more than likely, right, playing Georgia, in their path. Although I think Notre Dame could very much beat Georgia, especially with Georgia's inability to score. So yeah, I mean, it's a wild ride. It's going to be a really fun, next 6 weeks of this thing, 8 weeks of this thing, whatever it comes out to be. And there's going to be a lot of storylines.
I think that's a really great point, Zach. Like, imagine being Oregon. You go undefeated, you claim the number 1 seed, you're going to get all this time off, and oh no, there's that team that almost beat them in Eugene, potentially looming for that rematch, and motivation and understanding maybe, hey, if you get a little pressure on the quarterback this time, it could be a very different outcome. But that's getting down the road. Ohio State starts with Tennessee. You had an interesting
real quick, hold that thought. I would take it one step further, and I'll let you get right back to it. Oregon, if they're looking at the bracket, they would rather play Texas, Penn State again, or Notre Dame, right? Like, you take those 3 other seeds that are home, they would rather take the winner of those games rather than the winner of Ohio State, Tennessee, and I guarantee that. But go ahead.
Yeah, that's not what they want to see any more than Ohio State wanted to see them sticking at 8, which again makes no actual sense. But so you and I were talking about this in the middle of last week as we started to gradually move on from the loss in the game and start to look ahead to the opportunity that was ahead for Ohio State. And we were looking at prospective paths. And there was part of you that thought, hey, maybe the best thing would be giving Ohio State a big time challenge right off the bat, something to prove themselves, get a jolt of confidence rather than being gifted a rematch with Indiana or, one of the paths with the Big 12 champion. It seemed to me, at least on that Wednesday, maybe we were talking about it, that's what you thought would be better for Ohio State in terms of refocusing and then carrying that forward if they were going to make a run at a national title. You still feel that way?
I do. I thought very strongly that a rematch against Indiana wouldn't have been the best thing. They've already beaten Indiana. No negativity towards Indiana whatsoever. But if you beat them in the first round, I don't think this Ohio State team's gaining a whole bunch of confidence. We talk about confidence and how dangerous that is, especially this time of year when you have a locker room that's buzzing with confidence and that swag, and you go out there and you can put it on the field. So yeah, I thought Indiana would be in that 10 slot. And so being in that 7, facing Indiana, and then having to go on and play the winner of the SEC championship game wouldn't have been the best move for them. I wanted them to have a bigger test at home, whether that have been, you've seen it, Alabama at home, if they were the 6 and Alabama was 11, with Tennessee at home, with the 8 and the 9. Now looking at it, I'm almost more these college football. Well, I will just say this college football bracket and that committee does maybe not what they think, but what TV wants, right? And so I still thought Ohio State should have been higher than the 8, but I thought they would have finagled it to get a big time matchup with a high profile team. And so if you want to talk about Ohio State, probably in my opinion should be in the 7. I strongly believe that Penn State should have been in the 8. But I still would have thought they would have finagled it in a way where maybe Indiana drops to the 11 and still plays Notre Dame in the 6, and Tennessee maybe drops back to the 10, or, they bump a team up, whatever it might be. It's just the 8-9 matchup. It just sucks. But I love the test of Ohio State in Ohio Stadium. Once again, getting that sour taste out of their mouth. They beat Tennessee. Guess what? This team can go off and do a lot of things. Just the thing that's tough is, in my opinion, the biggest challenge to Ohio State in this entire playoff is Oregon. And now you're facing them in the second round. But guess what? If they go out to Pasadena and they beat Oregon in the Rose Bowl, you could be looking at this team in Atlanta, Georgia on January 20th.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, look, that's the reality of winning a national championship in brackets. Like, if you're going to win that trophy, you're going to have to beat the best teams in the country to do it. So I think, yes, it would have been understandable if Ohio State didn't have to do it 4 times against 4 elite opponents, because let's be real, there are not every team in this field is elite. Clemson has proven repeatedly that it is not. SMU is not. Like, there are paths forward here that didn't require doing that, but I think we all sort of understand that at some point Ohio State was going to have to play Oregon. So
yeah, Austin, you make that comment. If I were to ask you, how many teams do you think in this playoff can actually win the national championship?
3, maybe 4.
Yeah.
You?
I say 4, and depending on the day 5. Right.
Yeah.
I think you have to look at Oregon, Georgia, Ohio State for sure. I think Texas is obviously number 4, and I think Notre Dame, if they have a good day, right, can definitely win it. I think if you look at all of those teams besides Oregon so far this year, have shown the ability to be beaten on any single day. But I think of those 5 teams, if any of those 5 teams get hot, they can win it. Outside of that, I don't see really any other team having the ability to win this playoff.
Yeah, and I think, that's why going into Selection Sunday, Ohio State still had the 3rd best betting odds to win the national championship, because their best is better than anyone else in the country. If they reach that potential, which we've really not seen maybe in a complete game, to be honest. The Penn State win on the road was impressive, but it had flaws. Their best maybe overall performance came with some major questions defensively when they nearly beat Oregon on the road. That came in a loss. Indiana was a pretty thorough victory, including on special teams. But I understand why there are people nitpicking at Ohio State's resume. Like, they lost 2 games. That is a big part of it. You can't argue with wins and losses, and the loss to Michigan is as damning as it can possibly be. But I think maybe Saturday should have offered a reminder that Texas is not some explosive dynamo with Quinn Ewers at quarterback. Georgia is a very inconsistent, bordering on bad offensive team, and they were better without Carson Beck at times in the SEC championship game. Forget about the ACC title game. Like, that's not relevant to this conversation. Oregon, that was one of their better performances of the season, but they let Penn State move it up and down the field on them repeatedly. So I guess the point is, there is some truth to something that you brought up earlier in the season, which is that there may not be one truly dynamic, dominant team in college football this year, which is why this playoff bracket in the format this year may work out in Ohio State's favor if they are able, which is the big question, to recover mentally and physically and emotionally from what happened a week and a half ago in the Horseshoe. Because if they do get past that, then the hardest path could be nothing to them. They could rattle off 4 wins, no problem.
For sure. And I'm going to back up what you just said. You look at Ohio State and probably their 3 biggest matchups of the year. I don't want to call it a game because the Michigan game was a huge game for them, but their 3 biggest matchups, Oregon, Penn State, and Indiana. You can argue really that any of those 3, they didn't play perfect by any means, right? Like Oregon, the offense made some mistakes, right? We're talking about the fumble of Quinshon Judkins, the pick of Will Howard, and then you talk about the defense and them not being able to stop Dylan Gabriel. And in my opinion, they still should have won if it weren't for that phantom offensive pass interference of Jeremiah Smith that we could talk for days about, right? Like you talk about Penn State, yes, they won by 7, but after that game, you think about that game, you're like, oh my God, Will Howard's fumble running into the end zone, the deep ball to Jeremiah Smith that wasn't completed, the deep ball to Carnell Tate that wasn't completed. Like they should have won that game by 3 scores, right? That should have been a 21-point victory, arguably. Then you talk about Indiana, and yes, they won handedly against Indiana, but it still wasn't a perfect game, right? Defense played well, but special teams touchdown, right? Like it was tight at half. Special teams touchdown by Caleb's down kind of opened it up. And then they obviously scored very late. But there were a bunch of things in that game where the offense wasn't clicking on all cylinders. And so you start talking about that Ohio State team compared to these other teams, you hit the nail on the head. Texas did not look good in the SEC championship game. Like Quinn Ewers was missing guys left and right. You know, if that SEC championship game was the Big Ten championship game and those were Big Ten teams, the national media would be going off about how bad the Big Ten is. They just would. Like it was a bad performance of football. You talk about the Big Ten championship game and we talk about Oregon being, you know, the best team in college football. And everyone says, you know, by far they're the best. They gave up over 500 yards to a Penn State offense that couldn't even move the ball against Ohio State, right? Like until late in the game, like, that Penn State offense is not good. Drew Aller is not a great quarterback. And that Oregon defense was just getting cooked up, right? If Penn State could make any kind of stop, they would have won that football game. And you even go to Georgia. I mean, we could go on and on about how much they have just not looked good at times against Ole Miss, against Georgia Tech. I mean, they didn't look good again. And then we talk about Notre Dame. Notre Dame out of anyone, and I understand. They've went 10 straight wins. They're playing very well. They arguably have the worst loss of any team in the college football playoff, right? Like they lost to a Northern Illinois team that, they finished 3-9, something like that, right? Like 3-9, 4-8. I forget what it was, and I might be way off with that, but it was a bad loss. And there's times where Notre Dame doesn't look great, right? Like when they played against USC, yes, they ended up pulling ahead late. But USC was in that game, and USC is not a good football team. So, like, we could go on and on about all these teams and their flaws and how they haven't looked good. But I think that's what makes it so exciting. And at the same time, you could hang your head about this Ohio State seeding of 8-9. And trust me, we could go on and on about Tennessee. Tennessee looked atrocious in some games this year, right? But guess what? Ohio State has the ability and the playmakers and the coaches to go on a run and win this thing. They just have to come together emotionally, physically, and go out and do it.
Yep. I think that's it. I mean, I can't argue with it. That's the biggest question about this team moving forward. Because if they do, they can beat anybody, and they can the hardest path in front of them. They can knock it down 4 times in a row. Aside from the seeding itself, Zach, what was the first thing that you thought about with this matchup with Tennessee?
It is the very first thing that came in my head. I obviously went to Ryan Day, and don't ask me why. I did, and I was maybe going to sugarcoat that answer a little bit of like taking it to the team of, you know, vengeance and being able to flip the script, but I just can't. I have to be honest about it. This is a Ryan Day game, and what I mean by that is everyone has slammed Ryan Day for not winning big games. Everyone has slammed Ohio State and Ryan Day for not being able to beat the SEC. This is an SEC team that is coming into your house with everything on the line. Like this is the Ryan Day vengeance game, right? Like I talk about the team, but no, this is Ryan Day being able to just cook with an offensive game plan that literally puts Tennessee in a blender and they win this game big. Like if Ryan Day can do that, there is going to be so much confidence within him, within this coaching staff. He needs this win more than anyone. And that's not just the players on the field. This isn't for the seniors. And I know everyone's talked about the seniors for the last 9 days since the Michigan game of not winning anything, coming back for so much stuff. This isn't for them. This is for Ryan Day to mentally be able to move on from that loss against Michigan and some of the losses that have transpired over the last couple of years with all the Michigan games, with Georgia, with Missouri last year, with Clemson, right? When he first started in 2019, like this is that big game with an SEC team that he can hang his hat on and build on, especially when it comes to recruiting, right? This gets brought up in recruiting. They negative recruit against him for this. This is the game that is just hanging there for Ryan Day to take and to change, flip the script on his entire mantra within Buckeye Nation in their feelings toward him.
We've kind of retired the bit, but it is something that we talked about a lot, mainly in 2023. Peach Bowl Ryan Day. Like, did he rediscover that? Like, why did he bounce back from that loss to in the game so emphatically and put together such a great offensive plan? And like, what was different? Why was he so loose and confident and aggressive? Like, can he do that more frequently? And we didn't talk about that a lot in 2024 because it was more of the CEO year, but that's what he has to be against Tennessee. That's what he's going to have to be against Oregon. Like, this is it now. Like, everybody is waiting to see how Ryan Day responds. And I think you're right about that, because I do think the Buckeyes, and I made this point with you last Monday, the Buckeyes on the field played with the energy, played with the passion, played with the intensity, the physicality that they needed to. The plan wasn't good. That is why I think you're absolutely right. The first thing that has to come to mind, no matter what seed would have popped up, no matter what opponent, this is the Ryan Day, whether that's vengeance or whether that's validation or, gosh, I don't even know what the alternative would be, but it is all on
the Ryan Day revenge tour. That's what it is. This is the Ryan Day revenge tour, and he's got everything in front of him. You want to talk about, a hard path? It's Ryan Day's revenge tour. You go out there and make some noise, and you knock off Tennessee. You knock off Oregon. You have the chance to play Texas, and you knock them off, and then you knock off Georgia. Oh, come on! Like, that is the ultimate revenge tour, right? That's Stone Cold Steve Austin style, walking out of the arena with double birds going out, right? Like, that is this couldn't set up better for Ryan Day to send a message to the rest of the country. Like, hey, listen, I am who I am, and I'm here to stay, and even send a message to the rest of Buckeye Nation of, hey, you may have wanted to get rid of me on November 30th, but guess what? I'm here to stay. Right. And that's what I'm so excited about with these matchups.
All right. Those matchups are set. Selection Sunday is done. Moving forward, we've got a week and a half, about a little less than 2 weeks to go until that matchup in the Horseshoe. We're going to have plenty more to break it down in the weeks ahead, including a lot more from Zach Boren as we get ready for Ohio State and Tennessee, the 8 and 9 in the new 12-team playoff era. It's weird, but it is underway. Thanks to Zach, as always, for joining us for a Boren Blitz on a Monday edition of the Podcast Daily. I am Austin Ward. We'll talk to you later.